where is the inflation?
Well, we are going through one of those, thankfully, remarkably rare periods when inflation is not apparent. Like so of course I have to be careful. Inflation is always somewhere in the system. There's always one of the great joys of being a speculator is there's always a bull market or bear market somewhere. You just got to know where to look to find the damn thing. And of course, for sure, there's asset price inflation, and that can be, for sure, that can be corrosive, and it has lots of more than latent dangers. It can split society between the haves and the have-nots. So I don't wish to undermine that. So the inflation that we do have is, I want to call it a social inflation, and an inflation that separates citizens. The inflation that we don't have is an inflation in the price of labor. We don't have an inflation in the price of goods and services. And so we find ourselves in one of these events which first took root in the human consciousness, in literature and in scientific textbooks, if you will, going back around 1825, 1830, when up until that point, when bad things happened, and bad things would be crop failures, and of course the lunatic fringe of monarchies, especially in Europe, deciding to invade and take over another monarchy. And these were occasions which would affect the life and the lifestyles of ordinary families. These are points where you'd find that you had no money, that you had hunger, that you had no employment. But you could rationalize it because the corn crop failed, or we were at war with France. But from around about 1825, 1830, there was none of that. You had all of those terrible social consequences, but it wasn't obvious why you were suffering. And you were suffering owing to a banking crisis coming out of London at the time being the center of the financial universe. And after the Napoleonic Wars, the UK had gone off the gold standard, and its banks had become fearless and had discovered lending to sovereign nations in South America, and had discovered the United States of America, and were making the first infrastructure investments in the canals. And there was an overinvestment cycle, and the London banks were becoming fearful and had no credit appetite, and they were pulling money back from the system and back to the center. And this is why poor ordinary folk in Paris, Zola's Les Miserables talks about this time. This is when we start talking about, this is when Marx and Engels start saying, hey, the system's finished. This is all over. This is when it begins. And so let's call that 1830. We then had another period very similar, which came through in not long afterwards, really. Let's call it no more than 50 years, where we had a massive, again, banking debt-fueled cycle in infrastructure, this time being railroads in the United States. And again, we had a recipe of failure and credit contraction. And that gave us a long period where we had no labor price inflation or inflation in goods and services. And then, of course, the 1930s and today. So really, I want to say 200 years. There've been other episodes if you've been unfortunate not to have lived in the kind of the strong social democracies that we would associate with the United States, with countries like the United Kingdom, etc. But really, for those nations, maybe 4 such events. So it's very rare, and that's why it's confusing. Other things in our life is like the Earth's rotation around the sun. We get seasons. When it snows, we understand it because it happens many times in the course of our life. But you could live many human beings have lived on this planet, in this universe, and have never experienced what we're experiencing. So there you go. We're fortunate to have that observation, but of course there are many misfortunate people who are suffering the consequences.